By the early years of World War II, Britain faced a growing concern in the skies over the English Channel. The aging Hawker Hurricane, which was once a key defender during the Battle of Britain, was now rapidly falling behind. It couldn't keep up with the latest German designs, and without a serious replacement, any future air superiority, especially the kind needed to support a cross-channel invasion, was now in serious doubt. That meant no secure staging ground for D-Day and no real chance of liberating France. So, Britain put its hopes in something new. An aircraft built around one of the most powerful engines ever produced. On paper, it looked like a dream, but once it finally entered service, that dream came apart, quite fast. The new fighter turned out to be unstable, dangerous, and in some cases, outright deadly, but not to the enemy. It had a reputation for killing the very men who flew it. Pilots quickly learned the odds of it catching fire or failing mid-flight were far higher than they'd seen in any other aircraft. And soon enough, squadrons started referring to it as a death trap. And this was all happening just as the Luftwaffe rolled out the Focke-Wulf 190, a faster, more heavily armed German fighter that immediately began to dominate the skies over Europe. But that wasn't the end of the story, because the Typhoon, the very same aircraft pilots dreaded flying, ended up playing a role no one expected. It was repurposed into something else entirely, almost by accident, and in that new role, it would help tip the balance of the war. World War II didn't leave much room for slow development. If a design wasn't being rushed through testing, it probably wasn't getting built at all. Aircraft were being designed, flown, and deployed as soon as humanly possible. The pressure to innovate was constant, and falling behind meant getting immediately outmatched in the field. Even before the Hurricane had finished proving itself in combat, the RAF was already thinking ahead. In 1938, they started looking for its replacement, something faster, more powerful, and ready to face the upcoming next generation of German fighters. Speed was the top priority. RAF tacticians knew they'd need an aircraft that could break 500 miles per hour just to keep up with what the Luftwaffe was preparing. So Hawker's chief designer, Sidney Camm, took the basic outline of the Hurricane and began to rework it around a much larger engine. That engine was the Napier Sabre, a 24-cylinder powerhouse that even today is remembered as one of the most powerful piston aircraft engines ever mass-produced. It could crank out over 2,500 horsepower at a time when most fighter engines barely managed half of that. The Sabre was actually two engines stacked together in an H-shaped configuration. That gave it a compact form with just a brutal output. But to harness that raw power, the aircraft also needed the largest propeller of any fighter in the world at the time, spanning more than 14 feet in diameter. Camm's creation became the Hawker Typhoon. It was designed as a mid-altitude interceptor and was originally fitted with 12 Browning 303 machine guns, each carrying 500 rounds. Just for comparison, the Spitfire was first designed with 8 machine guns and was considered extremely well armed at that moment. That gave the Typhoon serious firepower on paper, and with that monstrous engine, it was supposed to be Britain's ultimate dogfighter. But for some reason, things didn't go as planned. The Typhoon began flight testing in 1940, and at first, the pilots were excited to fly a plane which had power and speed unlike anything else of the time. The Typhoon was blisteringly fast in a straight line, but with that speed came problems, and they showed up almost immediately. During one of its early test flights, a major structural flaw revealed itself. The tail section wasn't strong enough to handle the stresses of the Sabre engine in full action. In one case, the rear of the aircraft nearly tore clean off in mid-air. The test pilot that day, Philip Lucas, somehow managed to keep the plane from disintegrating and landed it safely. It was a harrowing recovery that earned him the George Medal for bravery, as few people believed that aircraft should have still been in the air at all. That flight forced engineers to redesign the tail, but even after that, problems kept piling up. By 1941, Typhoons were being deployed to airbases along Britain's southern coast. The first operational squadron to switch over from Hurricanes was the first to learn the aircraft's most terrifying flaw. When you tried to start the Napier Sabre, it had a nasty habit of bursting into flames. You see, starting the Typhoon was a job in itself, and a dangerous one. Unlike the simple electric systems used in most Allied fighters at the time, the Typhoon's massive Napier Sabre engine relied on a far more complicated and volatile method. To get it going, ground crews had to fire 2 explosive cartridges, similar to shotgun shells, just to kick the pistons into motion. Everything had to be timed perfectly. The fuel had to be primed with extreme care, and the engine was so sensitive to temperature changes that even mild conditions could prevent it from starting. If anything was slightly off, the result could be a violent burst of flame right out of the engine cowling. Most pilots were used to hopping into a cockpit, hitting a button and getting airborne. The Typhoon didn't work that way. Its starting process was so temperamental that overpriming was common, and when that happened, fuel would leak into the engine housing. The next attempt to start it often produced a sudden flash of fire. For more than a few pilots, that meant serious burns, and very soon, the engine's reputation caught up with it. Crews began treating every startup like a potential emergency. Fire extinguishers were kept close at all times, and no Typhoon went airborne without someone standing by, ready to put out flames. One pilot who was new to the Typhoon reportedly shrugged off the routine at first, thinking the precautions were excessive. That changed quickly when his own fighter ignited on the runway. While ground fires eventually became less common as crews learned to handle the engine more carefully, the Typhoon still earned a reputation as a dangerous aircraft to operate. Structural concerns lingered, and with good reason. At one airfield, a fresh pilot named Roy Crane arrived ready to fly his first Typhoon, but before he could even climb into a cockpit, he watched one of the aircraft spiral out of the sky. It twisted erratically, then slammed into the airstrip in a violent explosion. The pilot was killed instantly, and investigators later found that the tail section had separated mid-flight. Again. This wasn't a freak accident. It had happened before, and it certainly looked like it would happen again. But even that wasn't the full extent of the Typhoon's flaws. There were reports of pilots blacking out in mid-air with no sign of enemy engagement. It turned out the engine's exhaust system was leaking carbon monoxide into the cockpit. Pilots were passing out from poisoning while flying, usually without realizing what was happening until it was too late. And if a pilot did manage to stay conscious during an emergency, escaping the cockpit wasn't exactly straightforward. The Typhoon's door design looked modern. It opened sideways like a car door. But in an aircraft spinning out of control or crash landing, that design became a serious problem. Many pilots struggled to get out in time. By this point, the RAF was having a hard time finding volunteers to fly the Typhoon. Between the engine's fire risk, structural instability, carbon monoxide exposure, and dangerous cockpit layout, it was becoming a serious morale issue. More and more, commanders started to wonder if the aircraft was even worth keeping in service at all. The Typhoon had been designed as a high-speed, mid-altitude interceptor, but in reality, it couldn't fill that role. Its dangerous handling and repeated technical failures outweighed any theoretical advantage its powerful engine offered, and by the time those flaws became impossible to ignore, RAF Command was seriously considering pulling the aircraft from frontline service altogether. However, before production had been halted and Typhoon squadrons grounded, something unexpected happened. A new threat appeared, and the Typhoon was suddenly the only thing fast enough to catch it. By 1943, the Luftwaffe had deployed one of its most capable and feared aircraft across the English Channel. As we said, the Focke-Wulf 190, which had first entered service back in 1941, had already demonstrated that it was above anything the Allies put against it. It had easily outperformed the Spitfire Mark V, directly forcing the RAF to scramble for alternatives. An earlier attempt to pit the Typhoon against the 190 had gone badly, due to the Typhoon's long list of issues we talked about. But now the situation had changed. The 190 was being used for lightning-fast strike missions. German pilots were flying in low, trying to stay under the radar, attacking targets along the coast, and then vanishing back across the channel before Allied defenses could respond. The RAF needed something that could intercept them, and there was only one fighter in British hands that had the raw speed to do it. So once again, the Typhoon was called into action. This time, however, it wasn't the same aircraft as before. It had gone through significant changes. The original cockpit design had been replaced with a more practical bubble canopy, improving visibility in dogfights and pilot escape options. Oxygen systems had been improved to address the earlier issues with fume leaks, and just as importantly, the men flying it had changed too. Only the most skilled and experienced pilots were now assigned to Typhoon squadrons. This combination of upgrades and elite crews finally unlocked the Typhoon's full potential. When the 190s came screaming in over the channel, Typhoon units were waiting. They could climb fast, close the distance, and catch the German fighters before they reached safety. For the first time, RAF fighters were able to consistently bring down the raiders, and they did it again and again, forcing the Luftwaffe to abandon its cross-channel strike missions entirely. The RAF had positioned Typhoon squadrons all along the southern coast of England, creating a fast response shield that stretched from airfield to airfield, taking the advantage German aircraft initially had. The Typhoon's speed and reaction time gave the RAF control over the airspace above the channel, and once that defensive line held, it changed the air war completely. One veteran pilot described what it felt like to push the Typhoon's throttle forward. He said that the force was so intense, it felt like getting slammed in the back with a sledgehammer. That engine, so troublesome early on, had finally become a weapon worth using, but the Typhoon still wasn't done. What came next would completely redefine the aircraft and arguably help turn the tide of the entire war. It was a 23-year-old squadron leader named Dennis Crowley Milling who first saw the Typhoon's potential as something more than a fast fighter. With D-Day approaching, RAF planners were looking for ways to attack German targets in northern France with precision and speed. The Typhoon, with its rugged build and high speed, logically looked like a possible solution. However, the aircraft was rearmed. Its machine guns were replaced with RP-3 rockets, giving it the firepower of a small artillery battery. Each rocket carried a high-explosive or armor-piercing warhead and was fired in pairs or volleys from rails mounted beneath the wings. They weren't quite precise, actually far from it. Aiming was done visually, and the rockets were known to wobble in flight or scatter wide of their mark. But that didn't matter much, because when Typhoons sprayed them on a column of vehicles or a German bunker, the effect was devastating. Just one direct hit could obliterate a tank, and near misses were more than enough to shred supply convoys. And when you combine them with the Typhoon's ability to dive in low and fast, then escape before enemy defenses could react, it became a terrifyingly effective weapon. The Typhoon became the first aircraft in history to use this kind of air-to-ground rocket technology effectively in combat. In the build-up to Operation Overlord, Typhoon squadrons were trained in a new tactic. They would fly low across the channel, just meters above the sea, to stay under the radar and avoid detection. Once over French territory, they'd rise up just long enough to identify a target, then dive in at full speed, releasing bombs and rockets. Typhoons were faster, harder to hit, and able to strike with much greater precision. In the months leading up to the Normandy invasion, they knocked out dozens of German radar stations, anti-aircraft batteries, transportation routes, and supply hubs, cutting off the roads and rail lines German forces would need to move reinforcements to the beaches. By the time Allied troops stormed ashore on D-Day, the Typhoons had already done much of the important work behind the scenes. Their destruction of communications and logistics networks left German defenders blind and slow to respond. Ironically, the aircraft that had once been seen as a completely failed fighter, dangerous to its own pilots, rejected by squadrons, and nearly scrapped, had now become the most effective ground attack weapon in the Allied inventory. It was never supposed to be that, but that's exactly what it became. By the end of the war, the Hawker Typhoon had flown thousands of missions and destroyed more enemy vehicles than any other Allied aircraft in the European theatre. Many historians today believe that without its contribution, the success of D-Day and the Allied push through France might have looked very different. However, their success didn't come before many of the young pilots flying it got their lives taken by the very plane they flew.